How does a player signed with huge expectations end up being treated like a mistake before his career even begins? How does a teenage prospect stuck on a major league bench and denied the chance to develop eventually become one of the most feared power hitters baseball has ever seen? Before the home runs, before the MVP, before the Hall of Fame plaque, Harmon Killebrew was viewed as an awkward problem created by the system itself. Too young, too raw, too expensive to fail, yet too unpolished to trust. And yet, over the next 2 decades, he would launch more than 500 home runs, terrorize pitchers across the American League, and redefine what quiet power truly looked like. So what went wrong at the beginning? And more importantly, what changed everything? To understand that transformation, we have to go back to a small farming town in Idaho. Long before the name Killebrew ever struck fear into Major League Baseball. Long before Major League Baseball ever noticed him, Harmon Killebrew grew up far from bright lights and packed stadiums. He was born in 1936 in Payette, Idaho, a small agricultural town where life followed the rhythm of the land rather than the calendar of sports seasons. This was not a place that produced professional ball players. It was a place that produced workers. Killebrew was the youngest of 4 children in a household shaped by discipline and quiet strength. His father, a former athlete himself, believed deeply in structure, humility, and responsibility. From an early age, Harmon learned that effort mattered more than attention. Days were filled with chores, physical labor, and long hours outdoors. Strength was not trained in a gym. It was earned by lifting, caring, and enduring. Tragedy arrived early. When Harmon was still a teenager, his father passed away suddenly. The loss left a permanent mark. It forced maturity long before fame ever appeared on the horizon. Baseball became less about dreams and more about stability. It was a path forward, but also a responsibility. Despite his size and natural power, Killebrew was not groomed as a baseball prodigy. He played multiple sports and excelled at football as well as baseball. College recruiters saw him as a potential quarterback, not a future home run hitter. Even then, his talent felt undefined. Powerful, yes, but raw. Impressive, but not polished. In Idaho, there were no elite programs to shape his swing, no professional mentors to guide his development. What he had instead was repetition, solitude, and a growing physical presence that seemed to come naturally. He did not chase attention. He did not demand recognition. He simply kept working. But as his body grew stronger and his swing louder, one question lingered quietly beneath the surface. Could a kid from a farming town with no spotlight and no roadmap survive a professional system built for cities, speed, and instant results? Or would that same system break him before he ever had a chance to become who he was meant to be? Harmon Killebrew did not enter professional baseball through the usual door. There was no slow climb through the minor leagues, no gradual shaping of raw talent. Instead, his career began with a decision that would quietly work against him for years. When the Washington Senators signed Harmon Killebrew as a teenager, they committed a massive bonus by the standards of the time. That single choice triggered baseball's bonus rule, a regulation that forced teams to keep highly paid prospects on the major league roster. The intention was protection. The result was paralysis. At just 17 years old, Killebrew was placed on a big league bench he was not ready for. He could not be sent down to learn. He could not fail in private. Every swing, every mistake happened in full view. While other young players developed quietly in the minors, Killebrew sat, waited, and absorbed the weight of expectations he did not ask for. Opportunities were scarce. At-bats came sporadically. Rhythm never formed. When he struggled, critics pointed to the bonus rather than the context. The label began to stick. He was too raw, too stiff, a questionable investment. In reality, he was simply unfinished. Those early seasons were defined by stillness rather than momentum. He trained, he watched, and he learned from veterans who were often fighting for their own survival. Confidence was tested daily, so was patience. For a young player built on repetition and physical feel, the lack of consistent playing time was quietly damaging. Yet he endured. He did not complain. He did not rebel. He adjusted his expectations and waited for the rules to change, for the moment when baseball would finally allow him to grow naturally. When the bonus rule was eventually eliminated, the barrier that had stalled his development disappeared overnight. For the first time, Killebrew was free to play regularly, free to fail, adjust, and improve, free to become more than a name tied to a contract. The question was no longer whether he had power. That had always been obvious. The question now was whether time had already taken something from him, or whether the player everyone doubted was finally about to show what had been hidden all along. The moment Harmon Killebrew was finally given freedom, everything changed. No announcement was made, no headlines predicted what was coming, but quietly, once regular playing time became reality, the game began to slow down for him. For the first time, Killebrew could settle into a rhythm. Day after day, at-bats stopped feeling like isolated tests and started to feel like a process. Timing replaced tension, confidence replaced survival. The raw power that had always existed beneath the surface no longer appeared in flashes. It arrived consistently. Pitchers noticed before the media did. Fastballs that once challenged him began to disappear from the strike zone. Breaking balls came earlier in counts. Defenses adjusted their positioning. Something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer a young player trying to justify a contract. This was a hitter forcing the league to respond. The breakthrough season did not feel accidental. Home runs arrived in clusters. Long drives carried deeper and louder. His swing did not look violent, but the results were undeniable. Each mistake by a pitcher seemed to carry consequences that could not be undone. What made this transformation even more unsettling for opponents was his demeanor. There was no celebration, no glare, no showmanship. Killebrew rounded the bases the same way he walked to the plate, quietly and without drama. The damage spoke for itself. By the end of that stretch, the narrative had flipped completely. The prospect once labeled a problem had become a solution. The player once hidden by rules and doubt was now impossible to ignore. He was no longer discussed in terms of potential. He was discussed in terms of fear. More importantly, this breakout rewrote the story of his early years. The struggles were no longer evidence of limitation. They were proof of patience, proof that the system had delayed him, not defined him. And as the league adjusted to this new reality, one truth became clear. This was not a temporary surge. This was the beginning of something sustained, something heavier, something that would dominate the American League for years to come. The question was no longer whether Harmon Killebrew belonged in Major League Baseball. The question now was how long anyone could survive facing him at the peak of his power. Once Harmon Killebrew reached his prime, there was no ambiguity left in his game. This was not a brief explosion or a fortunate stretch. It was sustained dominance, delivered year after year with a consistency that forced the American League to recalibrate its expectations. Season after season, the numbers piled up. Home runs in the 40s became familiar. Run production followed naturally, not because he chased it, but because pitchers could not avoid him forever. Walks increased as fear replaced aggression. When mistakes happened, they were punished without mercy. What separated Killebrew from many power hitters of his era was not just distance, but discipline. He did not swing wildly, he waited. He understood the strike zone. Pitchers learned that trying to nibble only delayed the inevitable. At some point, they had to throw something hittable. And when they did, the result often landed deep into the stands. By the late 1960s, his presence in the lineup altered entire game plans. Managers avoided him when possible. Bullpens warmed early. Defensive shifts appeared long before they were common. Fans arrived early, not for spectacle, but for anticipation. Any swing could become a moment. The defining peak arrived in 1969. That season was not simply about home runs. It was about completeness. Killebrew combined power with patience and leadership, earning the Most Valuable Player award in a year that cemented his place among the elite. It was the clearest statement of his career. He was no longer correcting a narrative. He was writing one. Minnesota embraced him fully. In a city still shaping its baseball identity, he became the anchor. Not loud, not flashy, but trusted. Children copied his stance. Adults measured eras by his seasons. He represented reliability in a sport obsessed with stars who flickered and faded. Opponents described a unique kind of pressure when facing him. There was no intimidation through words or gestures. There was only inevitability. One pitch too close, one lapse in execution. That was all it took. As milestones approached, they arrived quietly. 400 home runs, then 500. When the historic moment finally came, it felt almost understated, followed immediately by another blast that reminded everyone this was not a ceremonial achievement. It was business as usual. Yet even at the height of his dominance, there was restraint. No excessive celebration, no declarations of greatness. Killebrew remained the same presence he had always been. Calm, grounded, focused. This was the peak of a player who had waited years to become himself. A man who had endured stagnation and doubt, now standing at the center of the game, forcing everyone else to adjust. But as with all great runs, time was already beginning its quiet work beneath the surface. Power, when sustained for too long, leaves marks. By the early 1970s, the same strength that had defined Harmon Killebrew's greatness began to exact its cost. His body, once a source of quiet reliability, started sending warnings he could no longer ignore. Back problems emerged first, then leg issues. Small injuries that once healed easily now lingered. Swings that used to feel effortless required more preparation, more caution. The production was still there, but the rhythm had changed. Recovery took longer. Consistency became harder to maintain. The irony was cruel. Just as Killebrew reached historic milestones and public recognition peaked, his physical foundation began to erode. He crossed the 500 home run mark, a number reserved for immortality. Yet he was no longer the same force who had terrorized pitchers nightly. The achievement felt triumphant and bittersweet at the same time. Team success added another layer of tension. Minnesota reached the postseason, but October delivered frustration rather than closure. Big moments came and went without the ending fans hoped for. Individual greatness did not always translate into championship glory, and that absence lingered quietly around his legacy. Then came the ending that felt wrong. After the 1974 season, contract discussions stalled. The franchise he had helped define chose a different direction. Killebrew, the symbol of Minnesota baseball, was suddenly wearing another uniform. He finished his career elsewhere, returning to his old stadium not as a hero being celebrated, but as a visitor passing through. There was no bitterness in his public response. No accusations, no resentment. He accepted the transition with the same restraint that had defined his entire career. Still, the image was difficult to watch, a legend fading out of the place where he belonged. This period stripped away the mythology and revealed the human reality beneath it. Aging, pain, displacement, the understanding that even the most powerful careers do not get to choose their final chapter. Yet through all of it, one thing remained unchanged: his dignity. In decline, just as in dominance, Harmon Killebrew carried himself with quiet resolve. And in that restraint, his story gained a deeper weight, one that extended far beyond statistics or highlights. When Harmon Killebrew's career is reduced to numbers, the picture is already impressive. More than 500 home runs, an MVP award, multiple All-Star selections, a place in the Hall of Fame. These figures alone justify his place among baseball's elite, but they do not explain why his name still carries weight decades later. Killebrew's true legacy begins where the box score ends. He represented a kind of power that did not need volume. In an era filled with louder personalities and sharper edges, he stood apart through restraint. He did not intimidate with words or theatrics. He intimidated through certainty. Pitchers knew that if they made a mistake, it would be punished, and they knew it without him ever having to say a word. Teammates described him as gentle, approachable, and deeply respectful of the game. Opponents echoed the same sentiment. There was admiration without envy, fear without resentment. That balance is rare in professional sports, especially for someone whose job was to dominate. His story also reshaped how failure is understood. Early in his career, he was labeled a disappointment not because of what he lacked, but because of how the system handled him. In time, his success reframed that narrative. He became living proof that delayed growth is not wasted potential. Sometimes it is simply potential waiting for the right conditions. Within Minnesota, his influence extended beyond wins and losses. He gave a young franchise legitimacy. Fans did not just watch him play, they trusted him. In many ways, he became the emotional foundation of the team's identity during its formative years. Compared to other sluggers, his greatness felt quieter but no less heavy. He was not the most flamboyant, he was not the most controversial. But his consistency created a deeper imprint. When conversations turned to reliability, to leadership, to the kind of presence that steadies a clubhouse, his name surfaced naturally. Even after retirement, his reputation remained intact. He carried himself with humility, spoke honestly about the difficulty of letting go, and never tried to embellish his own story. When illness eventually ended his life, the response reflected what he had built: respect, gratitude, a sense of loss that felt personal to people who never met him. In the end, his legacy is not defined by how many baseballs he sent into the stands. It is defined by how he endured being misunderstood, how he remained grounded at his peak, and how he accepted decline with grace. Harmon Killebrew did not just destroy opponents, he dismantled the idea that greatness must be loud to be lasting. At the beginning of this story, Harmon Killebrew was framed as an unwanted prospect, a teenage signing trapped by rules, judged too early, and shaped by a system that did not know how to be patient. For a long time, that label followed him quietly, even as he tried to earn his place one at-bat at a time. But history has a way of correcting itself. Killebrew did not become great by shouting louder than the doubts around him. He became great by outlasting them. He endured years of stalled development, carried the weight of expectations he never asked for, and waited for the moment when the game would finally let him be himself. When that moment came, he did not hesitate. He did not look back. He simply delivered. More than 500 home runs later, the idea that he was ever unwanted feels almost absurd. Yet that early misunderstanding is what gives his story its power. It reminds us that talent is not always obvious at first glance, and that systems built for speed often fail those who require time. Harmon Killebrew destroyed pitchers, records, and reputations, but his most important victory came quietly. He destroyed the narrative that had once limited him. He proved that patience can be stronger than hype, and that dignity can coexist with dominance. So the next time greatness appears slowly or arrives in silence, remember this story. Remember the prospect who was nearly written off, and remember how once given the chance, he changed everything. If this journey resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the legends who were misunderstood before they were celebrated. And if you want to keep exploring the forgotten paths to greatness in baseball history, stay with us for the stories that still deserve to be told.